Hey, welcome guys. This time we're going to have a look at the TVR, and I'm not going to do a full-on review this time for a couple of reasons. First off, it's Scotland, which means it's raining, and it's not really going to do the car justice if the first time that I properly show it off it's wet outside. But at the same time, it's Scotland, so if I don't do videos when it's raining, chances are I'm not going to get any chances to really do videos. So instead of doing a full-on review, what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about how I found this car in the 4 years that I've now owned it. Part of the problem with TVRs is, they've got a little bit of a questionable reputation, especially with reliability. And because there's not many of them, you hear rumours about things, you hear rumours about how they drive, how they handle, and you don't really know what to believe. So although I really wanted one, I never quite had the confidence to actually make the commitment to buy one. Spent absolutely ages searching. I've literally spent years researching TVRs, and at the point that I said now's the time I want to buy one, it was several months between actually saying yeah, now's the time, and actually saying yeah, this is the car that I want. And it's a little bit difficult because if you're buying something like, I don't know, Mazda MX-5, BMW M3, Porsche Boxster, something like that, you've got absolutely loads of cars to choose from. You can be really picky. You can say I want it to be in Imola red, and it has to be a 2005 car, it has to have a manual gearbox, it has to have black leather, all this sort of stuff. And you can be really picky because there's enough cars made, even these cars that were made in relatively low volumes, to basically get whatever you want. And when I started, well, not long after I started looking at the Chimaeras, I very quickly realised that I couldn't do that. I couldn't afford to be picky. So after a lot of searching, it's a long story short, I'll save the actual story of buying this car for another day. Found this one, test drove it, pretty much instantly knew that yeah, this is a car I want to buy. Did the deal with the relatively small dealer. He wasn't a specialist, it was almost like a part-time job for him, just buying and selling cars. Bought this, it was pretty much a straight swap with the Boxster. I think I paid about £500 difference. Drove it back home. It was about an 8-hour drive, which if you live in America you might think 8 hours is not that long. 8 hours in the UK is a long time to be driving a car. We're not used to it, our roads aren't really designed for it, it's just not really our infrastructure. Never gets old. Drove it home, very briefly, had it in the driveway before putting it in the garage. Put it in the garage, looked at the driveway and instantly saw it was leaking something. And I thought, yeah, this is probably about right, this is what I've got myself into with TVR ownership. Sold my Boxster, which cost me basically nothing in the 2 years I owned it. I just had to replace 2 coil springs, that was it. I didn't even have to service it because they've got 2-year service intervals, and I owned it just under 2 years and it was serviced when I got it. So within a few hours of TVR ownership, I had my first sort of real taste of things to come. Or at least so I thought. For the first while that I drove the car, I really liked it. The sound is really addictive, and it's a really raw car. Obviously you've got no driver's aids whatsoever, no traction control, no ABS, no stability control. So it's really all about man and machine working together in perfect harmony. And it was a really nice car. And I wouldn't necessarily say it was the best car I ever bought. It definitely didn't handle as well as the Boxster did, but it had other traits that sort of made up for that. But then after about 5 or 6 months of ownership, took it for its first service under my ownership. Took it to one of the best garages I've ever worked with, Dreadnought Garage in Callander near Stirling in Scotland. Spectacular standard of engineering from those guys. Took it there, got them to do a 12,000 mile service on it, which is the major service, and just to sort of generally give the car a bit of a once over as well. And they did so, and Brian, who's like the owner of the business, phoned me up one day at work and said, bit of bad news, your car's a little bit poorly. So I asked him what was up, and he went on to explain a few things which weren't too scary. There was a little bit of a leak from the clutch slave cylinder, headlight bulb, one of the dip beam headlight bulbs wasn't working, and maybe one or two other little things like that as well. But one of the things that I'd asked them to do when it was in was to wax oil the chassis, because the chassis in these cars are prone to corrosion. This particular one looks reasonable. I'd seen underneath it already and there wasn't anything too bad. The outriggers had been replaced just a couple of years before. So I thought I'll get them to wax oil it to give it a bit of protection. And you can probably see where this is going. Brian said to me, there's bits of your chassis which are really badly corroded. And there's no point wax oiling them, because to get rid of the surface rust, to make it worth wax oiling, we're basically going to be chipping away so much that we're just going to destroy any remaining integrity in these parts of the chassis. So that kind of ruined my day. After about 5 or 6 months of ownership, I was having to make a decision that I knew I was going to have to make at some point, but I'd expected it to be after 1 or 2 years, which was, do I want to actually keep this car? And it was probably a few days of thought before I sort of properly concluded, yeah, I think I do. I think this is one of the best cars that I've owned, and it's worth spending, you know, a decent amount of money on it to get it to be as good as it can be. And to give you guys a bit of an idea, replacing the chassis on one of these is about £5,000 or £6,000, but in doing so, you'd be stupid to not replace other things at the same time. So things like the suspension, any other sort of hard to get to parts, so things like, you know, we'll see brake lines and fuel hoses, you're going to get anyway just as part of the work. But wishbones, basically anything underneath the car that's not engine, gearbox and differential, it really makes sense to replace it at the same time. And that means that you're adding £2,000 or £3,000 on to what's already quite a big bill. But in theory, by doing so, you essentially get yourself a brand new car underneath. So I spoke to a few specialists, was prepared to travel obviously quite a long way for this work to get one that A, was cheap, and B, I felt was going to do a good enough job. So I ended up using a garage down in Birmingham, Central TVR, which is, for those who don't know the UK, probably about 5 or 6 hour drive from where I live in Scotland. And they did a fantastic job, took the body off the car, put a replacement chassis in it, did everything that they had to do, and then I promptly said goodbye to about £9,000, which incidentally was just a tiny bit less than what I paid for the car in the first place. The slightly redeeming thing is that because the chassis are sort of known for corroding on these cars, when you get work like that done, it does actually have quite a significant impact on the value of the car. You know, it's not like, you know, a lot of time if you get a car resprayed, for example, the respray might cost you £4,000 or £5,000, but it might not actually make any difference to the value of the car, and it might add £500 on. Chassis work does actually make a reasonable difference. But other than that, that's the only big piece of work I've actually had to get done. There's been a few other smaller things, but nothing too scary. The car has never let me down, you know, touch wood. And I think sort of, as long as these cars are reasonably well looked after, as long as you're taking them to specialists and keeping on top of things yourself, there's no real reason why they ever would let you down, because the majority of the parts on them are off-the-shelf parts. And this was from a time when sort of 70% of the cars that TVR were making were made from off-the-shelf parts, and only about 30% of things were made in-house. Which is quite a good business model for them, because I mean that all of the things which are really hard and expensive to make and test, like engines, gearboxes and brakes, you know, the things that have a lot of money going into R&D and testing, all of those things were off the shelf, so they were reliable. And all of the things that you see and feel, all the things you interact with, you know, the indicator stalks, the heater controls, things like that, are all custom. So to sit in this car or to look at it from the outside, there's virtually nothing that you see which has been borrowed from another manufacturer. Which, in contrast to a company like Morgan, which uses switches that look like they're at a bus, and Lotus, which has quite a few Vauxhall parts on display, there's actually very little in the TVR anywhere that you see that makes you actually realise this is from a small-scale manufacturer. The question that you always get asked is, can you get parts for it? And the short answer is yeah. Like, you can get pretty much anything, no problem at all. You know, there's 2 or 3 very, very large suppliers. Now that TVR are starting up production of cars again, they've got their own genuine parts scheme. And a lot of the original sort of dealers and service centres also supply parts as well. These are all available online. Like, there's absolutely no problem getting any parts at all. And like I say, a lot of the major components are from major manufacturers. So when you've got a braking system that was sold on hundreds of thousands of Fords, you've got absolutely no problem getting anything for that. You've got no problem getting discs or pads or whatever. I think whenever you buy a car like this, the most important thing is to make sure it's got good comprehensive service history from dealers or sort of properly recognised specialists. One of the problems you have with specialists as well is that there's nothing that would stop me, you know, buying that garage over there and opening myself up as a TVR specialist tomorrow. And while I know quite a few things about how this car works, I am most definitely not a specialist, but there would be nothing that would stop me advertising myself as such. So as I said in the video of the Abarth, the Abarth is my daily drive. This is essentially a fun car for me. So it's not something which gets driven every day. It does a few thousand miles a year. But people still often ask, you know, is it something you could actually daily drive? Or more likely they assume it's not and they say, oh, well, you wouldn't want to daily drive that. But to be quite honest, there's no real reason why you wouldn't. Like, yes, it's got a very, very heavy clutch. It's got a very, very firm brake pedal. It's got a very, very heavy accelerator. It's got a very, very heavy gear shift. You need quite a lot of strength to make the handbrake work. It's got power steering, but it doesn't really do a huge amount to assist you. Pretty much everything in this car you have to work for. But I don't think anything is so extreme that you couldn't practically sort of live with it on a daily basis. You know, if you lived in London city centre and you were driving to somewhere else in London city centre, this probably isn't the most appropriate car. But if you live somewhere in the countryside or on the outskirts of a city, I see no real reason why you couldn't use this as a daily drive. Fuel economy, it very, very much depends how you drive it. If you're on a long motorway cruise, you'll get 30 miles per gallon. That's UK gallons, probably about 34 US gallons probably. If you're absolutely thrashing it about on a back road, you'll probably get somewhere between maybe 18 and 23, depending on how hard. But things like tyres and brakes, compared to something that will give you similar performance, you know, from a modern car, everything's so much cheaper. Like, the brakes on this are so much smaller because it's so much lighter. The tyres are so much narrower because that's just how they were then. But yeah, like, I see no real reason, if this is the sort of car that you like, I see no real reason why you couldn't practically have one as a daily drive. I think if you've got the money, you would probably want to have something a bit more sensible. But you know, if you've only got the option to have one car, I think this would be a reasonable one. It's so much fun to drive, even compared to modern day sort of high performance sports cars, you know, which you'll pay £100,000 for. It's still very, very quick. It will still hold its own. You know, you're still doing 0 to 60 in around about 5 seconds. You're still got a top speed way higher than any speed that you're legally going to do in the UK. But despite those things, I honestly would not recommend anybody buys one. And the main reason I would have for that is I don't think it's what most people want. But if you're thinking about it and you've properly done your research and you know what you're getting yourself into, I don't think you'll regret it. But you've got to keep in mind there is a reason why so many of these cars are sold on after someone's only owned them for 6, 12 or 18 months. I think it's customary when you're doing videos like this to talk about some things that you don't like about cars. And to be honest, you know, there's not really anything that I don't like about the TVR. And the reason I say that is because a lot of the sort of the faults or niggles that you might have with it, the fact that it's a little bit loud, for example, they're kind of what makes it so special. And yeah, there's definitely times when, you know, you're getting home a bit later at night and you're thinking, I'm going to wake all my neighbours up, or you're cautious when you leave early in the morning or whatever. And yeah, it would be a little bit nice to have a little button somewhere that you press it and it makes everything go quiet, the way you might in a modern 911, say. But that kind of, it defeats the purpose. You know, the whole point of it is it's meant to be loud and unapologetic. And if you were to have a button which made it less hardcore, it would just lose the magic. Although I suppose if I was to list maybe 4 or 5 things that I think would annoy other people with it, I think most people would find the general cabin noise to be a bit too loud. You know, there's not a huge amount of sound deadening in this car, and while, you know, I'm quite comfortable driving it on long distances on motorways or whatever, I think there'll be some people who would much rather have a whisper quiet interior. I think that the time it takes to warm up would also be a problem. You know, this is a reasonably big engine. You're driving for maybe 10-15 minutes, maybe 10 minutes before it's fully up to temperature and before you can actually floor it, and before you're getting hot air into the cabin. I think the lack of driver aids would be a big deterrent for a lot of people as well. I think even just having the knowledge and the comfort that you've got ABS there, and if you do mess it up or you go into a corner a little bit too quick, it's not the end of the world. I think it's a nice comfort for anybody. I think one drawback that people don't really consider when they buy them is that they are specialist cars, and you do really need to get them looked after by people who, like I say, properly know what they're doing. Changing the oils and filter in them is very, very easy, but it's all the additional things that a handmade car kind of needs on at least an annual basis. So somebody who can properly look underneath all of it, you know, get it up on a ramp, check out everything is tight, check that nothing's, you know, rubbing against anything else. The sorts of things that you wouldn't have to worry about on a mass-produced car, because they sorted all that stuff out in research and development and testing. And that does mean that you kind of do need to take it to a specialist, and you do need to pay a little bit more for the privilege of doing that. You know, the small garage at the end of the road probably isn't the best place to take a car like this to get work done. But overall, like, servicing costs a specialist for a major service, depending on where you go, will probably be somewhere between £400 and £800 a year. Minor services are maybe £100 or £200 below that. But I think in addition to taking it to specialists, it's also a car that you are going to want to be able to look at yourself. So if you're not comfortable with a set of tools, it's probably, again, not the best car to be buying, because although I've had no real problems with it, I think part of the reason I've had no real problems with it is I've had no hesitation to look at anything which wasn't perfect. So when, you know, the brake calipers weren't performing perfectly, I had no problem taking them off, having a look, ultimately swapping them for refurbished ones. It's not a big job, but if you're not comfortable doing something like that, that would have been another trip to your specialist, you know, and a few hours labour you'd be paying for. And it's not necessarily the cost, it's the inconvenience of something like that. And if your car's constantly off the road because you've got a 2 or 3 week lead time to take it to your specialist because they're busy and they're in high demand, then you'll very quickly get tired of the car. In terms of things that I can imagine people not liking as well, I think the very low down driving position is probably one of them. You probably don't see it too well on the camera, but I'm only just looking above the steering wheel, and I'm not a particularly short person, probably about 5'10", 5'11", and even with that, you know, I'm still sitting very, very low down in the car. It's something that personally I really like. I feel much more comfortable sitting low down in a car, but if you're the sort of person who wants to see the bonnet, you're not going to be able to do that. That's everything from Carbon Garage this time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and comment, and to be sure you don't miss out on future videos, including a full review of the TVR, please don't forget to subscribe.